August 19, 1792. A man flees Paris with nothing but the clothes on his back and terror in his chest. His name is Marie-Joseph Paul Yves Roch Gilbert du Motier, the Marquis de Lafayette. But soon he will have no name at all, just a number, just a ghost locked away in the darkness where Europe's most powerful monarchs hope the world will forget he ever existed. The kings of Europe feared this man more than armies, more than revolts, more than the guillotine itself, because Lafayette represented something far more dangerous than violence. He represented an idea that power could be limited, that kings could be constrained, that ordinary people had rights no monarch could take away. And for that idea they would bury him alive for 5 years in the cruelest prisons. Europe could offer not to kill him that would make him a martyr, but to erase him, to make him disappear so completely that even his name would be stripped away, replaced by a number scratched into a prison ledger. This is the story history wants to forget. Between the celebrated hero who helped America win independence and the mourned legend whose death caused Congress to order the entire United States into 30 days of mourning, there exists a chapter of horror so systematic, so psychologically devastating that it transforms everything you think you know about the man they called the hero of two worlds. 4 days after the storming of the Tuileries Palace on August 10, 1792, when Parisian mobs slaughtered the Swiss Guard and the constitutional monarchy Lafayette had spent years building collapsed in blood and screams, the warrant came. The Minister of Justice, Georges Danton, issued orders for Lafayette's arrest. Other moderate deputies were already being purged from the revolution, their heads already rolling into baskets beneath the guillotine's blade. Lafayette saw what was coming. The revolution he had helped birth, the movement he had tried to guide toward constitutional principles and gradual reform, had devoured itself and was now devouring its children. So he ran, but Lafayette made a calculation that would prove catastrophically, heartbreakingly wrong. He believed he could cross into the Austrian Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, neutral territory, and from there find passage to America, the one place on earth where his principles hadn't become a death sentence. He had American citizenship granted by several states after the Revolutionary War. He would invoke that protection. He would escape to the country he had helped create. Within days of crossing the border, Austrian forces intercepted him. Lafayette presented his American credentials, argued his case, invoked his status as a citizen of the United States. The Austrian commanders listened politely. Then they smiled. Then on September 12, 1792, they declared him a prisoner of state to be held indefinitely until a restored French king could decide his fate. Think about that irony. He was being imprisoned for weakening monarchy by the very powers claiming to defend monarchy. The Austrians and Prussians didn't see a French general seeking asylum. They saw an idea with legs, a living embodiment of the principle that common people could rise up and demand their rights, that ancient orders could be challenged, that kings were not appointed by God but constrained by law. They couldn't let that idea walk free, so they built him a tomb. His first cell was in the fortress at Wesel in Prussian territory, a damp, narrow space where daylight barely penetrated and silence pressed against the walls like a living thing. Complete solitary confinement, no contact with other prisoners. No news from the outside world, no letters in or out. They took everything from him, his watch, his razor, lest he use it to escape through death. His books, especially his books on democracy and philosophy, those dangerous texts that had shaped his thinking. And then they took something even more fundamental. They took his name. From the moment he entered that cell, the guards called him only by his prisoner number, not General Lafayette, not the Marquis, just a number in a ledger. He was no longer a person. He had become an entry in a prison record, a thing to be stored and forgotten. And while Lafayette sat in that darkness, called by a number, treated like an object rather than a human being, the world outside was being consumed by the very violence he had tried to prevent. The months bled together in the darkness. 3 months at Wesel, then transferred to Magdeburg Fortress, where conditions were identical. Isolation, dehumanization, the systematic erasure of identity. 1 year there, then Nysa near Poland, even more remote, even more secure, where the psychological warfare intensified into something approaching art. Guards would casually mention his impending execution while serving his meals in filthy pots. He had to eat with his fingers like an animal. Bathing was forbidden. Any attempt to maintain basic human dignity was punished. They wanted him to live in that space between life and death, never knowing which day would be his last, never knowing if the next sound outside his cell door would be guards coming to take him to a scaffold. The cruelty wasn't in what they did to his body, though chronic illness and malnutrition were eating him alive. The cruelty was in what they did to his mind, the complete uncertainty, the total isolation, the daily humiliation of being called by a number instead of a name. Meanwhile, beyond those stone walls, the revolution Lafayette had tried to guide was devouring France in an orgy of violence that would become known as the Reign of Terror. Robespierre and the Jacobins seized control. Approximately 40,000 people were executed. The guillotine blade fell again and again in public squares across France. On January 21, 1793, King Louis XVI was executed. On October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette followed him to the scaffold, and Lafayette knew none of this. Sitting in his cell, he had no way of knowing that everything he had fought for had collapsed into chaos and bloodshed. No way of knowing that his wife's family was being systematically destroyed. On July 22, 1794, while Lafayette rotted in Nice, 3 women were led to the guillotine in Paris. Adrienne's grandmother, her mother, and her sister Louise were fed into the same machine that had consumed thousands. Adrienne herself was thrown into La Petite Fosse prison in Paris, a holding pen for aristocratic women awaiting execution. She was scheduled to die. What saved her was a calculated political gesture by Elizabeth Monroe, wife of the American minister to France, who visited Adrienne in prison and loudly announced she would return the next day, forcing France to reconsider executing the wife of America's beloved Lafayette. If you've made it this far into this story, if you're feeling the weight of what Lafayette endured, consider subscribing to this channel. These are the stories that history often glosses over, the chapters of human suffering and resilience that deserve to be remembered. We dive deep into the darkness of the past, not to glorify horror but to honor those who survived it and to understand what human beings are capable of enduring. When Adrienne was released from French imprisonment on January 22, 1795, she did something that defies all logic and speaks to a kind of love that most of us cannot comprehend. She didn't flee to safety. She didn't try to rebuild her life in some neutral country. Instead, she petitioned the Austrian Emperor Francis II for permission to join her husband in prison. She asked to be imprisoned. The emperor agreed, probably calculating that a man with his family nearby would be less likely to inspire rescue attempts. On October 15, 1795, Adrienne, their daughters Anastasie, aged 18, and Virginie, aged 12, and Lafayette's elderly aunt Charlotte walked through the gates of Olmütz Fortress in Moravia, the most remote and brutal prison yet. After 3 years of separation, 3 years during which Lafayette didn't know if his family lived or died, 3 years of being called only by a number, he saw his wife again. She barely recognized the skeletal figure before her. He was described as terribly emaciated, the physical toll of the dungeons written across every hollow of his face and bone of his frame. The family stayed together in that damp cell for more than 2 years, 1795 to 1797, waiting, not knowing if they would ever be free. Adrienne's health, already damaged from her own imprisonment in France, deteriorated further in the moisture and cold of Olmütz. The illnesses she developed there would eventually kill her. Young Virginie, just 12 years old, spent critical developmental years confined in a prison cell and developed a pronounced stoop to her posture that she would carry, for the rest of her life, a physical mark of what those years had stolen from her. What finally freed them wasn't justice or moral appeals or international pressure. It was military necessity. By 1797, a young French general named Napoleon Bonaparte had conquered northern Italy and was pushing toward Vienna itself. The Austrian Empire was facing catastrophe. Napoleon needed an armistice. The Austrians needed to survive. And in the Treaty of Campo Formio signed on October 17, 1797, buried within its provisions was a clause providing for the release of French political prisoners held in Austrian custody. It wasn't because Napoleon cared about Lafayette. The two men would become bitter enemies. It was simply useful leverage. On the night of September 19, 1797, an Austrian guard led Lafayette, Adrienne, and their daughters out of Olmütz Fortress. For the first time in 1,826 days, Lafayette stood outside prison walls. He was 40 years old. He had entered the dungeons at 35, 5 years of his life gone, his health permanently broken, his fortune confiscated, most of his closest friends and political associates executed or scattered across Europe. But he was free. Free to discover that the world he had fought to create was already gone, replaced by something he barely recognized. In 1799, he was finally permitted to return to France, retiring to La Grange-Blenau, a modest estate outside Paris where he would live for the remaining 35 years of his life, watching Napoleon,